that other thing. Whatever it has to be. Whatever we have to do.
Maybe that's what I said. So let's be prepared as soon as these days start, so we can get it on the schedule.
Okay.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for being here. Appreciate all your coverage. Today's press conference will be just with Gary Barta. We won't have one-on-ones or anything afterwards, so if you have questions, please initiate those. Please speak up if you can when you're asking a question so that we can make sure that we can hear everyone and get that recorded. Feel free to remove your mask while you're asking a question. And again, appreciate your cooperation with all of the testing and everything that we do for these things, and thanks for being here. And with that, we'll get right to Gary Barta.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I'm going to attempt to cover the two announcements that were released a little bit earlier today, as well as talk about some of the events over the past week and a half, and also some things prior to that, and then I'll leave time and try to answer some questions. I'm going to start with the announcement that the University of Iowa's Office of General Counsel did announce that it has retained the services of Hush Blackwell out of Kansas City. They'll be conducting an independent review of the issues and allegations related to racial disparities within the football program. The review will begin immediately. It will not be conducted by me or anybody else in athletics, and in fact, it will report directly to the president. Of course, we'll be available to answer any questions, provide any information, and certainly everyone has agreed to cooperate. On the one hand, we don't need an independent review to tell us that we have issues. We know we have issues, and we have began taking steps to improve and move forward. However, the independent review is important in order to look into specific concerns that have been brought forward, to identify or clarify, maybe expand on some of the things that we are aware of. So that will begin. It's been shared with me that it will take weeks, not months. No hard date on finishing. That'll sort of depend on, I'm sure that will depend on where it heads. I'm going to move now to, over the weekend, the separation agreement that was finalized with Chris Doyle, the head strength coach. That process began with a discussion between Chris and I, and then the terms were discussed over a few-day period and then finalized yesterday on Sunday. I can tell you that during this past week and a half, I've been doing a lot of listening and thinking about important steps to move forward. And that's going to be important. And as part of that, I would share with you a few things. First of all, clearly there's still a lot of work to be done. One of the things, as difficult as it's been, I have really been encouraged and appreciated the deep and very difficult conversations that we've been having. The one that stands out to me the most is a team meeting that occurred a week ago today. And in that team meeting, there was some very difficult and challenging but important conversations had. It started out like really most team meetings that I've been associated with as a student athlete or as a staff member over the years. It was Kirk talking a little bit about the issues that had come up, and then I addressed the team with some of the issues that had come up. And then it probably would have been a normal meeting by normal standards if it would have ended there, but thankfully it didn't end there. Thankfully, some of the current players began really asking tough questions. At first they were directed at Kirk or me, but then an amazing thing happened. Then it became they were talking to each other, student athletes, coaches, staff members, and again, it was a very emotional and difficult meeting, but very, very important to getting started. So I'm grateful for the current student athletes that spoke up, and also for the former student athletes who spoke up really about a week and a half ago. So sometime during that week, as I was thinking through and trying to come up with next steps, I did come to the conclusion that one of those steps was that a separation with Coach Doyle was the thoughtful and sensible thing to do. Kirk and I talked, and we were both in full agreement that that was the case. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I ended up speaking with Chris first, and we just moved through that process. I can tell you this was not a decision that I made lightly, and it is just one piece of a plan that's going to be needed for us to move forward. I have some other comments I'm going to make, but before I do, one of the things that I wanted to do, and it's really important to me, is to say I'm sorry to former student athletes, coaches, staff, current student athletes, anybody who's had a negative experience with Iowa football. When I say negative, if you felt mistreated, misled, discriminated against, whatever the case, I truly am sorry. We want everybody who participates in our program to have a great experience academically, athletically, and socially. So now let me what I'd like to do at this point is go back prior to a week and a half ago and talk a little bit about what some things that have been occurring over the past year and a half in the athletic department and in the football program specifically. In the spring of 2018, we were reviewing the most recent graduation rates. And we saw that our African-American male student athletes across the department were graduating at a rate lower than their white peers. That's not new news at Iowa, and it's not unique to Iowa. Those statistics are similar at a lot of places around the country. But that was a moment in time where we decided we wanted to do something about it. And so at my urging and the department moving forward, a diversity task force was created. And the initial charge of that task force was to look into that specific issue, the graduation gap between our black student athletes, males mostly, and our white student athletes. And so we began that process. And then in early 2019, the task force came forward and shared a report. And the report summarized some issues or concerns that were raised during interviews with student athletes, coaches, and staff. And the key theme in that report indicated that many of our African American student athletes did not feel comfortable being their authentic self. The interviews were anonymous, and they didn't name specific individuals. However, there were concerning statements like, "I felt like I had to put a mask on to check my identity at the door. I was told by my coach to change my hairstyle because it didn't fit the Iowa culture." One student athlete said a staff member cursed and yelled, degrading an African American student athlete in front of his peers. The task force study that was done throughout the whole athletic department, not just football. And while no teams or individuals were singled out in the report, it was reported verbally that many of these comments were coming from football. So as a department, including football, we began to put a plan in place to address these issues. I'm going to share with you some of the changes that we had been making and were making, but before I do, I'm going to pause here and just share with you that and acknowledge to you that the events of the past few weeks nationally, and then specifically the numerous comments that have been shared by former or current student athletes within our football program, have made it clear to me, and I'm sure others in our department, and I know some others in our department, that the changes we had been making weren't enough, and they weren't happening fast enough. Some of the examples of the changes that occurred prior to last week. In July of 2019, we hired Broderick Binns as Interim Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I think many know that Broderick is a former player at Iowa and has been a staff member at Iowa. We indicated that there would be additional educational and training throughout the athletic department, including football, in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Kirk began meeting with the African American student athletes to discuss the concerns and talk about how we can move forward. Liz Tovar's office hired 2 PhD students. There's a long-standing Big Ten diversity intern plan, and we used to have them spread out throughout the athletic department. In this particular year, Liz hired 2 of them in her area, in the area of student services, and I know at least a big part of their job was working with the African American student athletes. We annually bring in an outside consulting group. The company's name it used to be the Dan Beebe Group. I know they have a different name now, but Dan Beebe is the principal. And what he does is he goes around the country and he speaks to staffs and student athletes. And this is an area where he talks to them without coaches in the room, without staff in the room. First of all, hear if they have anything they want to bring to him. Now, he's an outsider, so we don't necessarily expect that they'll bring anything to him, but he opens that opportunity up. And then he describes to them that when you do have a concern, if it's something that you're not comfortable going to your coach, or for that matter, going to anybody in the athletic department, he provides them direct information about other places they can go, on campus mostly, or potentially in the community. So we were doing that. We continue to do that. And then every year we have an anonymous survey that student athletes can fill out and voice their concerns. And then a group that I know some of you are aware of, it's called the President's Committee on Athletics, the PCA. They do interviews with student athletes and to ask them about their experience and to talk to them, see if they have questions or concerns, especially as they're leaving the program. They're involved in those interviews. So these are just a few of the examples. There are more things that are included in our diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. And prior to last week, I knew we were doing these things, and I had convinced myself that we were doing enough. And frankly, the past few weeks has been a wake-up call for me, I know, for others in the department. I know Kirk and I have obviously had numerous conversations over the past couple weeks, but for everybody in Iowa football and Iowa athletics. So we knew we were doing things. I'm just going to speak for myself. I thought we were on a path of making things better and doing the right things. The things I've heard in the last week and a half especially, clearly they weren't enough, and they weren't happening fast enough. So where do we go from here? As I mentioned earlier, we need to create a path forward. I mean, we are listening. We're going to continue to listen, and there's still a lot to be done there. There's still a lot of difficult conversations to have. There have been some really difficult conversations so far. I'm going to pause right there and just, you know, I was a student athlete, and I've been now involved with college athletics for many, many years. And over the years, I've had numerous conversations about I've had numerous conversations about racism, social injustice, but I would describe those as probably more surface conversations. You know, I think a lot of people are willing to say that, excuse me, I think there are a lot of people willing to say that racism is ugly and a bad thing. But the conversations that we've all been having nationally and that I've been having, have gone so much deeper than that. So, as we go forward, we're committed to change and improvement. I promise you we're going to make mistakes. And when we do, we'll correct them. I can tell you also they won't be perfect. There's always going to be differing opinions about what we should do, and a desire to have it done right away. And you know, I know how it works. We can make some changes immediately, but change is going to take time. So here are some steps that we have taken or that will be taken. It's been mentioned already, an independent review, and from that review we'll receive a report, we'll learn, we'll determine any additional actions that, that need to be taken in response. We'll continue to listen. One of the things that I've known, I mean, this isn't new, but we have to find better ways, and that is to make sure that people have a place to go if they don't feel comfortable. I would say, I normally say to student athletes, 99% of the things you need to resolve, whatever they are done between you and your coach. But if there becomes a situation where it's something you can't resolve or aren't comfortable resolving with your coach, we have to make sure that there are other places. We've said that, we've tried to make that clear, but clearly we need to get better at that. Kirk has announced that he's forming a former player council to help him make changes and move forward with his team. Kirk and his coaches and staff will work on and have been working on specific team changes within their program. I've already seen a lot of changes in a week, but clearly that's just the beginning. And I can tell you that Kirk has expressed how grateful he is, and I haven't been involved in all of their breakout meetings. I was just involved in that team meeting. But for the past couple of weeks, before last Friday and since last Friday, that he's relied on a lot of really candid and difficult feedback from his staff, and he will continue to do that. Broderick Binns will take leadership of the Diversity Task Force. As an aside, Broderick reports directly to Liz Tovar, a member of our senior staff. And in addition to having a direct report, many of the senior staff members on my team have an indirect or dotted line to other areas on campus. Broderick has full access and support from the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion staff, in addition to reporting directly to Liz Tovar. And Broderick and I have had numerous conversations over the last couple of weeks. Broderick and some others put together, again, prior to last Friday, put together a town hall meeting on racism and social injustice with our staff, with our student athletes. And Broderick, you know, because he played here and because he's very familiar with the University of Iowa, loves Iowa, I know he's going to do a great job. But the Diversity Task Force, he'll oversee that. It was never disbanded, but it wasn't, you know, it hadn't had a meeting for a while. He's going to continue that group, make sure that the representation of the membership it needs to be and will be and has been diverse, but also represents all the constituents. We need to make sure that that's represented, and then allowing them to talk about maybe a new charge. And one of the new charges is having that group be a conduit or a place, maybe that's a place where our student athletes can go, and they get to know the individuals on this group, and they earn trust with this group, and so they become a place where our student athletes know they can go. And they won't replace University of Iowa resources, but maybe they become a bridge to those resources. And they also, I envision them working with the PCA, the President's Committee on Athletics, and partnering with them and the student well-being, student athlete well-being committee. So I guess what I'm saying is the Diversity Task Force will remain intact. It might be slightly modified or take on a different charge, but I'll let the task force come up with that, and they'll have access. You know, I'll meet with them when they want to meet with me, report to me. They'll have access and report to the president, and as I mentioned, have access and report to the PCA and or the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion team. This was actually an idea in one of the conversations I had with one of our former student athletes. He wasn't necessarily suggesting this particular group, but he was suggesting a group. He acknowledges, this student acknowledges that we've tried to have these conversations about having a place to go, but not yet having that truly safe place where they can go and express if they have a concern. So I want the task force to help fill that role. And then looking at all of our current education and training program that we do throughout the athletic department, and we do a lot of it, and just seeing if we need to modify or redo the effective programming going forward. So a few final thoughts, and then I'll open it up to questions. I have learned a lot the last few weeks. I am listening. I continue to listen. And I've had, as I mentioned, I've had a lot of conversations about this topic over the years. But for the first time in my life, these conversations have gone so much deeper. And I don't know if that's the experience that the rest of America is having, but as difficult as it is, and you can tell by my emotion it's difficult, I'm excited that it'll give us a chance to move forward and get better as a country. I'm not deflecting what we need to work on at Iowa. I'm going to focus on that. I can't change the whole world, as I've told some of our students and our staff, but we can change where we're at here. So appropriately so, we're focusing on the difficult issues in Iowa football. And what I'm about to say doesn't deflect that, and it doesn't take away from what I've just been describing. I do remain confident that Kirk Ferentz can lead this team moving forward, and many of the attributes that we're all familiar with over the last 20 years, the on-field success, the community service, the personal development of players, providing NFL opportunities and access, dedication, perseverance, the WAVE, the Kid Captain program, all of those things are still there. And they're still all a part of the foundation and who Kirk is. Again, that doesn't excuse what we're focused on or what we're talking about, but the foundation is still strong. And so we need to rebuild trust, we need to get better, and then we can return to all those positives upon which the foundation was built. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit more than I normally do, and I'd open it up for questions.
So Gary, were you blindsided by this, or did you ever have any suspicions from observing from a distance maybe, or did this just catch you off guard?
Well, the stories that I've heard the last week and a half caught me off guard because I've not heard it from specifics like that. As I mentioned, we certainly learned some things when the Diversity Task Force interviewed student athletes, and so that was sort of an eye-opening experience. Again, we started making these changes, and I was lulled into thinking that these were good steps, and that it was improving. And I was basing that on my experience as I went to practice, as I watched games. I see all the NFL players or non-NFL players that love to come back and be a part of the program. So I was convincing myself that the changes we were making a difference. My eyes were wide open this past week and a half when I heard the stories that I heard. Yeah.
Gary, just given that, why didn't Iowa acknowledge those issues in 2019 when you heard about them from the Diversity Task Force?
Well, we did acknowledge them. We talked about them in the PCA, and we talked about moving forward some of the things that we wanted to work on. But again, it didn't make the magnitude of what we're now all seeing and thinking and hearing about this last week and a half. So we did acknowledge it. We didn't focus on it, but we put a plan in place to work on it. And as I'm admitting to you now, in hindsight and in context of what I've been hearing over the last week and a half, it wasn't enough, and we didn't do enough at that time, back in 2018, in hindsight. But we absolutely are focused on it and attending to it today.
Gary, several players, and you mentioned both Brian Ferentz, Seth Wallace, in some of their concerns of different incidents. How are those concerns going to be addressed? Is this part of the task force? And as officially Brian Ferentz's supervisor, what happens if he is mentioned and there's grounds for some sort of punishment, including termination? Well,
I think, I mentioned that on one hand, the independent review, we didn't need the independent review to show us that we have issues, because we know we do. But on the other hand, the independent review is important and critical to go into detail in concerns and then bring us back what they found. So, I'm not going to speculate on anything that's been talked about over the last week and a half as it relates to personnel, independent direct personnel, and I'll wait to see what comes back there. I'm not going to predetermine what I might hear, but clearly individual, if there are personnel issues that I need to deal with coming out of that, and or if there are just decisions that we can bring to the task force, we'll sort that out as the independent review is concluded.
Yeah, 2014, sorry, my thing got tied up here. You fired Tracy Griesbaum for bullying athletes. If this review comes back and determines there's been bullying, will you hold those coaches to the same standard?
Well, let me just say that each situation that I deal with or that we deal with is unique. So I'm fine with the question. It's a fair question, but I'm also very understanding that every situation is unique. So I'm going to judge this situation on what comes forward in its unique sense. What is in common, and this sounds simple, but student athletes having an opportunity to have a great experience academically, athletically, and socially is critical. And and that's the case whether it's field hockey or football. And I'm going to wait and see what comes back. I'm going to take that in account compared to other information that I have, and we'll make decisions based on that. But I'm not saying it's unfair because it's a fair question. I'm saying that every situation is slightly different, or maybe significantly different. It just depends.
Gary, you've been to a lot of football practices over the years. You've traveled with the team a lot of times. Were there ever instances when you saw things, heard things that were red flags in your mind? And also, did you ever attend off-season strength and conditioning sessions?
I've been in the weight room, but I don't ever remember being in there when it was active with working out. That's not... I try to go to practice during the fall about once a week. I don't always make it. I do travel with the team. Spring ball, I might make it to 1 or 2 practices. And to answer your question directly, did I ever see anything that raised a flag as it pertains to this? The answer is no. Do I see coaches yelling and screaming? Yes. Yelling and screaming is going to occur in coaching. And the way I always differentiate it, if someone uses a bad word, that doesn't cross a line. If someone yells really loud, that doesn't cross a line. Where I see crossing a line is when it becomes personal and not about whatever it is that's trying to be corrected. And to answer your question, no, I didn't see anything that crossed the line in the time that I've been here. And I've not been in the strength and conditioning room during workouts. It's just not, it just isn't something that, it's in a different building, and it's at a time of year when I'm not with football regularly.
Gary, when we asked Kirk about Brian about 10 days ago, he said that there were different levels to the allegations between Chris and Brian. Did you have a say in those conversations, and what about these situations and allegations? Where did you kind of come up with the conclusion that they were different levels, and have you talked to Brian in the last 10 days about that?
Okay, there's a few questions in there. One, no, that's okay. One is different levels of expressing concern. Here's what I'll share with you that I did on Saturday morning. I am not someone that spends much time on social media. I'm not against social media. It marvels. My 2 kids and the amount of time they spend, I just don't know where they find the time, and I just don't spend a lot of time there. Saturday morning, as I was hearing about what was occurring on social media, I spent a pretty good amount of time looking at what was being said. Beyond that, I have not spent time over the last week and a half. I just haven't had the time. And at some point, what's said on social media is not my focus. What I'm going to focus on is this internal or this independent review. And so I don't know everything that's been said about Chris Doyle or about Brian Ferentz. I've heard Seth Wallace's name mentioned. I'm sure Kirk has been mentioned. I'm sure I've been mentioned. But I don't know exactly what's, and I'm comfortable now waiting until that review. So if there are differences in levels between what's being, what Chris has been accused of, or Brian's been accused of, or Kirk, or Seth, or anybody else, sorry to name names, but I've heard those names come forward, that's where it's going to become really important for the independent review to bring forward what they learn.
Gary, I wonder why you said it would take a couple weeks for the review to come back. What was the decision that went into settling with Chris Doyle and essentially giving him $1 million instead of waiting until the end of the investigation was done?
Yeah, obviously, at some point, I came to the conclusion that what are the steps we're going to have to make to start moving forward. I wasn't, I knew that the independent review is going to occur, but I also knew that we needed to think of things that made sense, that were thoughtful and sensible to move forward. And that was one of the things that I felt just we're in strength and conditioning time right now, volunteer work. And I just decided that it made sense, it was sensible, and it was just a move forward. So I decided, and again, Kirk and I were in full agreement on that being a step, and I started having conversations with Chris, and I just decided that was a step. So the independent review is a step. Some of the things that have been going on with the team meetings was a step, and I decided this was an important step to start moving forward.
Gary?
I'll keep trying to get to everybody.
What gives you the confidence that Kirk can lead the program moving forward, and how do you explain Kirk having what he calls blinders to so much of this taking place over the last decade or so?
Well, I'll start with what do I base that I still have confidence that Kirk can move the program forward. Several things, but one, working with him for 15 years, seeing all the things that I shared that were positive, and then over the years when we found something that isn't positive, the seriousness and the way that he goes about trying to fix things that are not good. And so I've watched him, I've observed him for the last week and a half, or whatever it's been since a week ago Friday. And I know how this is impacting him. I know, what he's trying to do to move forward. And I know the difficult conversations he's having and his willingness to change. And so those are the things I'm basing it upon. As it pertains to not knowing or should have known, he knows as the leader of the program that he's responsible for everything and that occurs in his program. And how much he knew or didn't know, he and I have had several conversations about that, and I believe him that he didn't know all the things that he's heard, and that you'd have to ask him, but I'm confident that what he did know is that there were areas we could get better at, we needed to improve on, and they weren't enough, the things that we were doing. So I can't answer directly, other than what he shared with me, that he didn't know many of these things, and his willingness to say, I need to change, I need to get better. I base it on those things, as well as 15 years of watching him when he needed to make changes, his willingness to change.
Gary,
Let's go here.
Gary, kind of two questions. Have you heard from parents over the years that expressed concerns about Chris Doyle or any of the coaches? And also, Ohio State has the COVID policy. I'm wondering if you guys have, still have a pandemic going on too. Did you make student athletes sign some sort of release?
So that's two very unique questions, but maybe you were worried it wouldn't get back to you. So I'll try to answer both of them. First of all, I've had conversations with parents, not very many, but a couple, not about the types of allegations we're hearing in the last week and a half. It might be a parent who thinks that they should have had more playing time. I don't have a lot of those. Maybe thinking that there was a misunderstanding, but nothing to the level that we're talking about. So that's my direct answer to that. I see a lot of parents at games. I interact with parents a little bit, but I haven't had many real deep conversations with parents. And then to switch gears to COVID, we're still in the middle of trying to figure out the pandemic. I feel good about the way we're trying to bring people back. To answer your direct question, we have a pledge that our staff and our student athletes sign. It's not a release. It's more of a commitment and understanding that in order to reduce the possibility of someone getting infected, we all have to take personal responsibility. So every day I have to take a quiz or a test. I have to get my temperature taken. I tested. I was negative. And so I sign a pledge as well, like we ask our student athletes to sign.
Gary, how concerned are you right now about recruiting? The football program's ability to recruit right now under these circumstances?
Well, I think about it this way, Pat. If, as a parent, and I am a parent, but if I had a parent coming here, my first inclination would be concern, and rightly so. I haven't spoken to Kirk and the staff exactly what they've done, other than to know that they've followed up with all the families. And so my guess is a lot of them are either convinced or are going to wait and see. But certainly anytime your program goes through a negative situation and a challenging situation, it potentially can impact recruiting. That's not number one on my list of concerns right now. So more importantly, let's get it handled. Let's start putting the plan in place to move forward, and then recruiting will take care of itself. So.
Yeah, Gary, I was thinking, through the years, obviously, Chris Doyle was graded well on performance reviews because of the way the team performed on the field, the strength and conditioning that was applied to the way they performed. And I'm sure he passed those reviews with flying colors, and now we come to this point. And it hadn't been for James Daniels and a tweet that kind of ignited, because of that thing that happened to George Floyd, for people to speak freely about what's going on. Will there be additional lines added to criteria of that performance sheet for different coaches in the future, or how will you handle that evaluation?
So I think the best way to try to answer that is, yes, we'll make sure processes are in place, and we'll do those things. But more importantly, something you said a few moments before that, and it's what I've been trying to allude to, and it's when I do get emotional, and that is just our country being more comfortable to talk about this topic. I was in a conversation with 5 of my peers. I'm not avoiding your question about Iowa football. But, you know, I had heard the term DWB. I'd heard that over the years, but hadn't thought much about it. Driving while black. I was in a conversation with several of my colleagues from around the country, and there were probably 4 or 5 of them who are black, and they each told their personal story about the person when they were a young boy or just starting to drive that told them how they needed to act. Again, I've had conversations about race before. It's easy to say racism is horrible, but the subtleties of learning from colleagues and friends of mine and student athletes about what it's like to go through that is very impactful. Back to your question. Excuse me. We have processes in place, and I think our university processes are good. We'll improve them where they need to be improved. We can put more in a job description, but until we create an environment nationally and then drill down into Iowa athletics and Iowa football, where forget the form or the piece of paper or the job description. Are we really creating an environment where you have a place where you can share a concern and you know it's going to, one, you're comfortable sharing details and not just sugarcoating. You have to be willing to say, this is really happening to me. And as somebody who's been discriminating against, I understand more than ever before how hard that is. Even if someone's telling you they want to know, are you really going to be comfortable sharing the hard facts? And as I described to you in that team meeting last Monday, had those students, you talk about a former player who helped get it started. It also took some current players in the room, because there were no former players other than those that were on the staff that played, but there were no former players in that team meeting. Does somebody have a Kleenex that... There were no former players in that team meeting, and so it took courage and trust for those current players to speak up. So to me, that's probably one of the biggest changes that is occurring in our country. It is occurring in Iowa football. It needs to occur in Iowa athletics, and is. But we've got to have comfort that we can share openly and not be retaliated against, whatever that might be defined as. If it's your job, if it's scholarship, whatever it is. Excuse me, just a second.
Got time for just a few more questions.
Did you have any conversations with any of the former players who spoke up on Twitter? And if so, how would you characterize them? If not, I guess why wouldn't you have had conversations?
I have. Not a lot, but yes, a few. And those that I had, I would characterize as very honest and outgoing, upfront and direct, but also very supportive. So, again, I didn't have a lot of them, but those that I did didn't mince words, were very direct, but also love this place and want to see it get better, and help do that, help do their part to do that.
Gary, we had got requested and got a copy of Chris Doyle's, what was said to be his current contract. It looked like from that contract that he was in a period of 1-year extensions that would then be signed to be effective July 1st. If that was the case, why was that contract just not renewed? Can you talk to the state of his contract at this point?
Yeah, I mean, yes, he had a contract, but what really became our area of focus is coming up with a separation agreement. We used the contract as a guide, but I decided that to move forward sooner rather than later, right now, let's move forward, and it was the sensible, right thing to do, in my opinion, to help take that step. We created a separation agreement rather than enact a particular term in his contract.
It sounds like it was effective July 1st, so it could have been right now, right? Or
obviously, I've looked at his contract, but I mean, there are several different things that can occur within a contract. So, again, the focus wasn't 100% on his contract. The focus was, in my opinion, the sensible and most thoughtful way to go forward was to come up with a separation agreement. We did that. We didn't ignore the contract, but we did it in discussion independent of it.
You're going to have, I would assume, players who ask you how you can pay Chris Doyle $1 million to walk away. Do you have any answer for that to them?
Again, acknowledge that he did have a contract, but then more importantly to me, I have to find a way to help move us forward. And in my opinion, this was a thoughtful and sensible way to move forward. And I understand, Mike, that I mentioned in some of my comments, there's going to be a lot of opinion of what we should do, what I should do, what Kirk should do moving forward. There's going to be a lot of opinion in terms of how fast something should happen, and in all those cases, it doesn't make anybody else right or wrong. It just means those opinions, probably whatever decision I make or Kirk makes or any of us make, like some other situations, there's going to be a group that thinks it was the right idea. There's going to be a group that thinks it's the wrong idea. I sat down in listening and hearing and trying to make a decision to move forward, and decided that this was, I've said it a couple times, but I'll say it again, this was the sensible, the timing, the thoughtful way to take one step. It's not by any means the only step, one step to move forward.
Gary, you've talked a number of times about these conversations that you've had in the past few weeks that have gone on a deeper level about racism than you've had in your career. Presumably that means you've learned more about some of these power structures in this country that continue to keep racial inequality as it is. Have those conversations changed the way you might do your job, the hiring practices you have, the way you evaluate people? Have they made you look at your own work and how you can make changes in your job?
Well, the broad answer to your question is yes. I've learned a lot. I've heard a lot. My guess is, I haven't thought specifically about some of the things you've asked, but my guess is every time I make a decision moving forward in personnel and hiring, and I'm going to remember this moment in time. Shame on me if I don't. So specifically, I have committed myself way before any of this to be concerned about and care about diversity, whether it's racial diversity, geographic diversity, gender diversity. I've tried to, when I hire staff, I've tried to make that a priority. But you're right, this moment in time will like me to reflect and think even more when I go about those decisions.
Knowing what led us here, that some dangerous or I guess damaging patterns of behavior with Doyle were occurring. As you look back on the Rabdo situation now, do you feel like you missed the mark in not taking action then, that you sort of should have seen some of this coming?
I'm going to, again, Chad, the question you asked about field hockey and now a question about Rhabdo, those are fair questions. I'm not at all saying they aren't. But I haven't looked back and given myself and paused, say I should have done something differently at that time, because at that time, you might recall, we had a group on campus that consisted of medical professionals. It was a different situation, so I'm not looking back on that and thinking, what should I have done back then? Again, I'm trying to focus on this situation with what we're dealing with, what we're hearing, not just with Chris Doyle, with all the things I've heard in the last week and a half, with the things that I heard a year and a half ago in listening to that team meeting, and now trying to say, forge a way forward. What can we learn from what has happened, but what can we do, must we do going forward?
Just one or two more questions if we have anything.
There's a lot of talk about the power dynamic between players and coaches. And with all that going on, are you afraid that current players, even after all of this, are still going to be afraid to speak out? And what specifically can you do to give them confidence that they are free to speak out without any repercussions?
So yes, there will always be a hierarchy, and there will always be whoever sits in the chair. In my chair as athletic director, as a head coach's chair, coaches have a lot of influence, without question. Earlier, we were talking about how do you make sure that there is a place to go, there's an outlet for a student athlete or a staff member to go if they're concerned about that hierarchy, if they're concerned about if they say something it will impact their job status or their status as a student athlete. And so we have spent time on that in the past. We've spent a lot of time on it in the past. The topic that I've mentioned about the diversity task force, and maybe it won't keep the name task force, maybe it will have another name, but that group is a group that we need to make sure the student athletes know the people on the committee as opposed to just being names. We need to make sure that they interact with the committee so that they have a trust factor. And they know that if they come into one of those situations, they can go there outside of their coaching situation. I hope that answers your question.
Well, final question?
Yep.
Kirk was asked this on Friday about his ability to manage Brian or supervise Brian. You're obviously directly in charge of him. Do you feel like you can manage him? And we've all thought about this. If a situation like this came up, it could be a little sticky. And if you do feel like you can manage him, why is that so?
Good question, and it's obvious that Brian's relationship to Kirk, and so for that very reason, the university has a process. We don't. People might speculate that we don't, but we don't take it lightly. Brian and I do have regular conversations throughout the year, and they are. One of the things I've described it as, when it comes to football, X's and O's. Brian should not be coming to me for advice or having conversations, although I did play the game, but most importantly, that's he and Kirk. Where Brian and I have had conversations over the years, if we have, unrelated to this current topic, where we've had a situation that I've needed to deal with, it has been me. I'm sure Kirk has talked to him, but Brian and I have had very specific conversations about an area that I've wanted him to address. And then we've had very specific situations about his career and improving and preparing himself to continue to get better as an employee. So we have those conversations regularly.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate your time today.